1582. The storm wind swept across the hills of Transylvania, wrapping around us the damp and acrid scent of ancient forests. Isabeau and I slipped through the shadows, as silent as the night itself. The child we had rescued from the massacres of St. Bartholomew's Day was no longer a child. Isaac, shaped by the years under our tutelage, had grown into a young man with dark eyes, his soul scarred by hardship. France was no longer safe. The Inquisition hunted the impure, witch hunters burned monsters and sorcerers at the stake. Even we, Immortals, had been forced to flee. Transylvania offered us respite, a wild refuge where other creatures prowled in the darkness. But this was no ordinary exile. Isabeau had been summoned. A circle of ancient vampires wished to meet Isaac. Some saw him as an abomination, to be eradicated without mercy. Others, more curious, viewed him as an anomaly to be dissected, an intriguing mutation. A few, more ambitious, hoped to glimpse in him a new era for our kind, but all of them, without exception, feared that Azrael might turn his gaze upon him. Isaac, now more than ever, was indispensable. By day, we hid underground or in forgotten ruins, where the light could not reach our bodies. Isaac, however, walked among the living. He secured our passage, bribed the right people, tended to the horses and provisions, and ensured our anonymity. Where our faces provoked fear and suspicion, he was merely a young traveler, silently escorting his masters. Thanks to him, we moved forward, elusive, safe from the light and the traps set by those who hunted us. I remembered Isabeau's words, spoken centuries ago, when we were nothing more than wandering specters at the mercy of human wars.
We cannot wander forever. We must build something greater.
It was one of the rare times she had revealed an ambition beyond mere survival. Then she never spoke of it again. The moon rose in a starless sky as we reached the ruins of an ancient manor, lost deep within the Transylvanian forests. The stones were crumbling, the wooden doors gnawed by dampness. This place had once been home to our kind. Now it was nothing more than a decaying sanctuary, a makeshift refuge for lost souls. But we were not alone. In the shadows of the abandoned hall, a man waited, standing motionless beneath the flickering torchlight. He was not a vampire. His heart beat, slow and steady, almost too calm for a mere human. His breath was controlled, too calm, too assured. I stopped. Isabeau tensed.
He knows you are coming,
the stranger murmured, his gaze fixed on Isabeau. She did not respond.
He asks if you are ready.
Silence fell, thick, oppressive. The torches crackled, their sound distant like an echo.
Tell him I come in peace,
she finally answered, her voice slicing through the heavy air. The man nodded, but he did not need to speak. He already knew what he would report to his master. Without a sound, he disappeared into the shadows of the ruined corridor. I turned to Isabeau. Her gaze was fixed on something invisible, lost in the void. Then, without a word, she resumed walking, indifferent, as if nothing had just happened. I asked no questions, but the atmosphere had changed. A weight of unspoken anxiety lingered in the air. And for the first time in a long while, I felt as if we were walking towards something even she did not control. Azrael Zegrí. A name that echoed through the darkness of the vampire world like a curse. He was not merely an ancient, he was perhaps the first, the primordial shadow from which so many others had sprung. Isabeau, who feared nothing and no one, spoke of him with an unusual restraint, a respect tinged with fear. He was the one who had created her, who had torn her from mortality and cast her into the eternity of blood and night. But his abandonment, cruel and deliberate, had left an unhealable mark. The love she had once borne him had turned into an open wound, a burden she still carried. Perhaps it was that burden that had driven her to seek redemption, to prove that she was not merely the instrument of his downfall, but capable of surpassing her own legacy. His castle stood in the heart of Transylvania, an anomaly out of time, a fortress of black stone, erected on cold, barren land, frozen beneath a moonless sky. When the colossal doors opened, it was in absolute silence, as if even metal and stone refused to disturb the immortal stillness of the place. Inside, there was neither luxury nor ruin, only total immobility. Vast empty halls, dark walls, the pale glow of forgotten candelabras. This castle was not a home, but a sanctuary, or perhaps a tomb. Then he appeared. Azrael did not descend a grand staircase. He did not make an entrance like a king. He was simply there. Tall, draped in black, his ivory skin stark against the shadowed stone. His hair, white as the light of a dead moon, fell over his shoulders like a veil of extinction. He looked neither like a king nor a god. He was something older, more primal than those concepts. He barely moved, yet he filled the entire space. He was a presence that consumed everything. His eyes fell upon me, black at first, then shifting with traces of amber and red like blood frozen in ice. They did not judge, they did not condemn, they simply observed. Isabeau stepped forward without hesitation.
You know my wish,
she said. A silence. Then her voice fell sharp as a blade.
I await your word, Azrael.
The air grew heavier. Isaac, standing tall under that invisible weight, did not flinch. He did not yet know what it meant to be feared. Then Azrael spoke.
Why do you ask for what you already possess?
His voice was a knell. A blow struck against the silence, a deep, resonant wave that shuddered through my bones. Isabeau did not waver.
I want them to accept him, to see him for what he is. Nothing more, nothing less.
Azrael turned his gaze from her to Isaac.
They will see, but do not expect them to understand.
A pause. Then, a single nod. The hostile murmurs faded like smoke. But I knew what Isabeau refused to admit. She believed in a lineage freed from human weaknesses, a lineage driven by a higher purpose. Isaac was an anomaly, a paradox she had chosen to protect. But why? To prove something? To defy the laws of our kind? I had deluded myself into thinking we had saved him out of love. But a question gnawed at me. What if, without realizing it, I had become complicit in something far darker? We left the castle before dawn, without a word, without a glance back. Azrael's silence still echoed within me, heavier than any judgment. The night swallowed us as we crossed forgotten lands, until finally, hidden from all eyes, we found refuge. The nights passed, woven with waiting and uncertainty. Isabeau withdrew without a word, vanishing into the darkness. For an instant, a shadow denser than the others seemed to consume her, then everything faded. The wind rose, lifting the dust. I waited. She returned much later without explanation, without justification. But her gaze, it had changed. Dawn rose over the silent ruins. The storm wind had calmed. Through the cracks in the collapsed ceiling, pale rays brushed against the cold stone. In the depths of the sanctuary, where light never reached, Isabeau and I slept, a dreamless sleep, frozen, suspended in the stillness of the dead. But Isaac was awake. He had grown accustomed to these solitary hours, alone with himself while we rested, vulnerable. Usually he hunted, trained, or explored the surroundings. But that morning, he stayed. An odd impulse, irresistible, had held him back. He wandered into the chamber where we retreated before dawn. The shadows there were thicker, saturated with our presence. The bare walls bore the marks of time, with only fragments of forgotten histories remaining, writings devoured by the years, remnants of a past that could no longer be pieced together. A bundle of letters, carefully bound with a dark ribbon, caught his eye. The yellowed parchment, the fine and elegant ink. He recognized Isabeau's handwriting instantly. He hesitated. Then, slowly, he pulled out a page. The address at the top sent a cold shiver down his spine. Azrael Zegrí. His eyes skimmed over the lines. First a few words, then a paragraph, then everything. The sentences were cold, clinical, devoid of emotion. The subject continues to develop according to our expectations. His blood exhibits unprecedented properties. He may be the key to a stable hybridization. A knot formed in his stomach. He turned the page, faster. He is more resilient than anticipated, more docile too. I ensure his instincts remain controlled without arousing suspicion. Still too early to conclude. Observation must continue. Isaac stepped back into the shadows of the blackened beams, seeking refuge in the solitude of the adjacent room. The air was heavier there, thick with the scents of wax and old parchment. His trembling fingers brushed against the ring hidden beneath his shirt, the last relic of a past that was slipping away from him. He rolled it between his fingers in an absent-minded gesture. The worn metal bore the sigil of a long, extinct family, engraved with unsettling precision. As a child, he had worn it proudly, as a symbol of belonging. Now, he clenched the piece of metal in his fist, as if the weight of that memory could crush him. A candle flickered beside him, casting his own reflection onto the wall, warped by the flames. What he saw no longer resembled him. He was no longer the man he had been. His fingers tightened, his breath quickened. The very thought of staying repulsed him, and yet, another part of him still refused to abandon everything he had known. A cold burn spread through his insides. Everything had been a lie. Their love, their protection, their words. He had never been a son. Just an experiment. A hope for their kind. He turned away. Outside, the day awaited. Blinding, searing. Without a sound, without a backward glance, Isaac stepped into the light. The wind still howled through the ruins where we had taken refuge. It rushed through the broken stones, carrying the scent of ash and damp wood. A dying fire cast trembling shadows on the walls. I walked slowly, the letters clenched between my fingers. Aged paper, precise handwriting. Too precise. Azrael's. They were not left there by accident. They were not forgotten. I had read them. Every line still burned in my mind. The instability persists, but the process is progressing. Giving him the illusion of choice has eased his adaptation. If this fails, we will try again. A chill ran through me. These words left no doubt. Isaac had never been anything but an experiment. A creature shaped, dissected, observed. A thing, like so many before him. I stopped in front of Isabeau. She sat near the fire, eyes fixed on the flames. She knew. She had always known. I threw the letters at her feet. They scattered across the ground like dead leaves. How long? I asked, my voice steady. A pause. Then she answered, cold and absolute.
Since the beginning.
A gust of wind lifted the ashes. I'd expected a lie, some evasion. But no, just that. Since the beginning. We loved him. We saved him. She gave a slight shrug. You loved him. I shaped him. The flames flickered. Something shifted inside me. You never doubted? Never hesitated?
Why would I?
Her tone was measured.
He was promising.
Not a word of regret, not a flicker of emotion, just a clinical statement. I watched her expressionless. He was like our son. She finally turned to me, her eyes cold.
No. He was a possibility. A hope.
A pause. Then, almost indifferent.
You mistake affection for purpose.
The impact was immediate. Everything I had believed, everything I thought was real, nothing but illusion. I exhaled slowly. My pulse remained steady. And me? My voice was calm, distant. Was I an experiment too? Her gaze did not waver. Silence, heavy and deliberate. Then,
You were useful.
a precise strike, delivered without malice. I did not move. My world did not collapse. A slow, calculated breath. I thought we were in this together. My tone was devoid of accusation, just observation. But there was never a we, was there? Nothing. Not a word. Understanding settled over me like a closing door. I stepped back. Then again, she did not move. I turned. I walked into the night. Away from her. Away from all of it. She did not stop me. Not a gesture, not a glance. And when I was far enough, when she knew I would not return, Isabeau slowly closed her eyes. For a moment. Like the heartbeat of something long dead. I found him before dawn, sitting before the cold hearth of a ruined house. The silence weighed around him. His face, usually unreadable, was marked by horror.
Tell me, it's not true.
My throat tightened. He knew. I couldn't lie. He lifted the letter, his hands trembling.
I was an experiment?
His broken voice shattered the silence. He flipped through the pages with a sharp motion, reading aloud.
His blood is promising. We must continue observation.
My vision blurred.
He suspects nothing.
I took a step toward him, but he pulled back, his eyes burning with pain. They're just letters, I murmured uselessly.
Letters from Isabeau to Azrael. And you? You didn't know?
The hope in his voice cut me deeper than any blade. No. The letter shook in my grip. Isabeau's writing, cold and clinical, seemed to mock me. I thought she was protecting you. He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound.
Protecting me. She was monitoring me, and you saw nothing.
I remained silent. I had been blind.
Tell me, at least. Am I the only one?
His gaze bore into me. Silence was my only answer. He nodded slowly, then let the letter fall as if it were worthless.
I can't stay.
Isaac. I reached for him, but he was already stepping away. That night, he disappeared. He found refuge among those who hunted creatures of the night. He knew our strengths, our weaknesses. He had become their weapon. "13 years passed. The world changed, but the war never ceased. The screams of the dying lingered in the thick air, mixing with the ragged breaths of the hunted creatures. Blood ran through the mud, saturating the atmosphere with its metallic scent. Between the torn tents, the shadows of vampires rippled, elusive. The war raged on, but the enemy no longer carried a banner. It was no longer just a hunt between monsters and men. It had rooted itself in mortal conflicts. Prussia and the Habsburgs fought for control of Transylvania. And within the folds of this struggle, vampires and hunters waged a different war, One older, one secret. Isaac stood there, crossbow in hand. His gaze, burning with ancient hatred, had nothing human left in it. His body had changed. Taller, denser, every movement charged with restrained power. His features had hardened, his jaw sharpened, muscles taut beneath unnaturally pale skin. Dark veins marbled his forearms, remnants of the poison now coursing through him. His once brown eyes gleamed with a golden feral light. Even his breath was different, too steady, too controlled, as if he were holding something inside, something instinctive, something voracious. He was no longer just a hunter, no longer just a man, only a being caught between two states on the brink of his own transformation.
Still fighting your true nature.
The voice shattered the silence. Azrael emerged from the shadows. He did not walk. He glided like a specter cast upon the world, his coat unfurled behind him for a brief moment before stilling in the air. Isaac turned sharply, crossbow raised.
You.
A ghost of a smile touched Azrael's lips. He did not need words to assert his hold. "Why are you here?" I spat.
To finish what was begun.
A shiver ran down my spine. "What results?" His gaze pierced me.
What we have built. What we are.
Isaac clenched his jaw.
I am not one of you.
You already are. Look at yourself. Feel what burns beneath your skin.
Isaac stepped back slightly. But this time it was not fear that moved him. He controlled every motion, every breath. And when Azrael moved, a tear in the air, a blur of shadow, Isaac anticipated. He pivoted, dodging the darkness descending upon him, and fired. The crossbow crackled, not a mere bolt, but a charge infused with an energy even vampires feared. The impact echoed, a searing wave rippling through the space. Azrael stilled. He looked down at the open wound in his side. Thick, black blood oozed, smoking against the cold night air. A low, rasping laugh echoed, a sound closer to a growl than amusement.
Fascinating.
His voice was quiet, but there was a new tension in it. He lifted his gaze to Isaac, a glimmer of dark curiosity in his eyes, alongside the briefest flicker of irritation.
It is not a poison. It is a gift.
He murmured. Isaac's fists clenched. His breath was heavy, but he held firm.
A gift. Like everything else you forced upon me.
His voice trembled with an old fire, a strength he had never named. His body, too. The energy pulsed beneath his skin, raw, instinctive. I slipped into the shadows, letting my vampiric senses expand. I brushed against Azrael's mind, seeping into his thoughts like a subtle poison. He was powerful, ancient, but no one was untouchable. I struck him with illusions. The screams of the souls he had consumed, the specters of centuries past, faces frozen in silent terror. I felt his mind tense, his consciousness waver for the briefest instant. Tiny, but enough. Isaac lunged. Azrael raised his hand, but this time he was a fraction too slow. The weapon cut through the air, a flash of metal, real pain. The black iron blade sank into the ancient vampire's shoulder. This time Azrael's hiss turned into a cry. In a final burst of strength, he struck back. His arm lashed out, swift as a serpent, and his claws tore into Isaac's side. A searing heat spread through his body as blood gushed from the wound. A burning venom, laced with shadow, seeped into his veins, eating away at him from within. Isaac gasped, wavering, but he held firm. The pressure in the air intensified, a wave of raw energy that nearly brought me to my knees. But I stood my ground. Isaac did not retreat. He straightened, his gaze cold.
We can't kill him.
He tightened his grip on the dagger, ready to strike again. Azrael stared at us. No pain, no fear, only frustration. His fingers brushed against the wound, watching the flesh knit back together, slower than it should have. His gaze darkened. For the first time I saw it, genuine annoyance.
This thread that binds us, it will burn you in the end.
He murmured. Then he vanished, swallowed by the darkness. I turned to Isaac. He was still standing, barely. Then he dropped to his knees. His lips parted, but no sound escaped, and he collapsed. I did not dare move. Silence crashed down upon us. Victory had never tasted so bitter. I rushed to him. His breathing was erratic, his pulse barely there. Azrael's poison was inside him. Not a venom that killed, but a mutation, spreading insidiously. His skin paled, his features contorted in silent agony. There was only one way to save him. I tore open my wrist with my fangs and let my blood drip between his lips. "Drink," I ordered. He coughed, tried to recoil, but his body no longer obeyed him. I pressed my hand against his nape, forcing him to swallow. My blood seeped into him, merging with whatever Azrael had awakened. Isaac trembled. A violent spasm racked him. Then, suddenly, his eyes flew open. The world shifted. His gaze was no longer the same. His irises glowed gold, streaked with shifting red, a molten, incandescent light. His breath quickened. His skin thrummed with newfound energy. He was no longer just human. He was no longer just vampire. He was something else. The culmination of Azrael and Isabeau's experiments, what they had never been able to complete. I had just perfected their work, and they had no idea. I stepped back slowly. Isaac. He lifted his eyes to me. His expression was a mix of fear and wonder. Then, the faintest smile touched his lips. A shiver ran down my spine. The night had just found a new master.